While NATO leaders were still shaking hands in Ankara, President Trump stood in front of a room full of reporters and said something that should have been the biggest story of the entire summit. He said the ceasefire with Iran was effectively over. Not paused, not strained, over. And then he told everyone watching exactly what was coming next. We'll probably hit them hard again tonight. Hours later, that's exactly what happened. And by the time the sun came up over the Persian Gulf, sirens were sounding in 2 more countries. Oil prices were climbing again, and the waterway that carries more than a quarter of the world's seaborne crude oil was back at the center of a crisis nobody thought would reignite this fast. Stay with me, because the sequence of what actually happened in the last 24 hours matters far more than any single headline is currently capturing. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to stay up to date with the latest news and breaking developments. There is a specific moment worth starting with because it captures the whiplash of this entire story better than any summary could. On Wednesday, while the NATO summit in Ankara, Turkey was still technically underway, President Trump stood in front of reporters and made 2 things clear in the same breath. First, that the ceasefire with Iran, the one his own administration had signed just 3 weeks earlier, was effectively dead. Second, that more strikes were coming, and coming soon. I'll give them a little warning. We're going to hit them hard tonight, he told reporters gathered at the summit. But we'll see how it all works out. We'll probably hit them hard again tonight. Within hours, that warning became reality. To understand how we got to this specific moment and why it happened at exactly this time, you need to understand the sequence that led here, because none of this happened in isolation, and the timing is not accidental. Go back to February 28th of this year. That is when the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes against Iran under what was designated Operation Epic Fury, targeting military facilities, nuclear infrastructure, and Iran's leadership directly, resulting in the death of Iran's supreme leader. Iran responded with missile barrages against Israeli cities and American bases across the Gulf. And the conflict expanded into Lebanon as Iran-backed forces there launched their own attacks. On March 4th, Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz officially closed, threatening to attack any vessel that attempted to pass through it. A threat it followed through on repeatedly over the following weeks, with attacks on tankers, sea mines, and a genuine disruption to one of the most critical shipping corridors in the entire global economy. This is a waterway that carries roughly 27% of the world's seaborne crude oil and petroleum product trade. When it becomes genuinely contested, the entire global economy feels it within days, not weeks. That first phase of the conflict eventually led to a ceasefire, and roughly 3 weeks ago, the United States and Iran signed what became known as the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding, a framework specifically designed to end the fighting and open a 60-day window for direct technical negotiations over Iran's nuclear program and the possibility of sanctions relief. As part of that agreement, the United States lifted the naval blockade it had imposed on Iranian ports, and Iran regained the ability to sell oil on international markets. For a few weeks, it looked like this specific crisis might actually be moving toward genuine resolution. It's worth pausing here to understand exactly how significant that earlier closure had already been for the global economy, because it establishes just how much is genuinely at stake every time this specific dispute reignites. During the March through June phase of Iran's initial closure, shipping traffic through the strait dropped considerably as commercial operators weighed the risk of continuing to transit the waterway against the cost of rerouting entirely around the Arabian Peninsula, a journey that adds significant time and expense to any voyage. Cruise lines suspended operations in the Gulf entirely, stranding thousands of passengers aboard multiple vessels. India and Pakistan both deployed naval escorts specifically to protect their own flagged commercial vessels transiting the wider region, even while avoiding the strait itself. Fertilizer markets, which lack the kind of internationally coordinated strategic reserves that exist for oil, faced potential price increases of 15 to 20%, specifically because of disruption to this single waterway, with analysts warning of knock-on effects for global food production well into next year. This is the scale of economic disruption that becomes possible again every single time this specific dispute flares back up, which is precisely why watching how it resolves matters considerably more than the immediate military exchanges themselves. But here's the part: nobody covering this as a simple ceasefire collapse story is explaining clearly enough. The specific issue that reignited this conflict was not a return to the original disputes over Iran's nuclear program or its regional proxies. It was something considerably narrower and in some ways considerably more dangerous, precisely because of how narrow it is. It was a fight over exactly who gets to control traffic through the Strait of Hormuz and on what terms. As part of the interim arrangement, Iran and the United States had agreed to allow commercial ships to transit the strait without paying additional charges for a period of 60 days. But Tehran subsequently insisted on something considerably more significant than a temporary fee waiver. It demanded the right to control the specific routes vessels take through the strait, and to eventually charge fees for that passage going forward, a demand that would upend decades of established international maritime practice in one of the most heavily trafficked waterways on the planet. The United States and most Gulf Arab states have flatly refused to accept that arrangement, for reasons that go well beyond simple economic principle. Accepting Iranian control over transit routes and fees would functionally hand Tehran a permanent choke point over global energy commerce, one it could tighten or loosen depending entirely on the state of its relations with Washington and its neighbors at any given moment. And that's where this story changes, because Gulf states and the United States have specifically been working to route ships along the Omani side of the strait rather than through Iran's preferred channel, precisely to avoid handing Iran that kind of leverage. Iran, in turn, has treated every ship using that Omani route as a direct challenge to its claimed authority over the waterway. On July 6th, Iran launched missile attacks on tankers specifically for using that Omani-controlled channel instead of Iran's designated route, including a strike on a vessel carrying Qatari gas exports. This was not a random act of aggression. It was a calculated message delivered through force about exactly whose rules govern this stretch of water. The United States responded to those tanker attacks with a significant new round of strikes, hitting more than 80 separate locations across Iran's southern coastline, focused specifically on air defenses, coastal radar installations, and command and control networks, according to U.S. Central Command, along with a naval installation, and dozens of the small boats Iran has used throughout this conflict to harass and attack commercial shipping. Trump specifically mentioned that American forces eliminated roughly 28 of these small boats in a single night. The stated goal, according to CENTCOM, was to degrade Iran's ability to threaten freedom of navigation through the strait. The United States also revoked the oil export licenses that had allowed Iran to resume selling crude on international markets under the ceasefire terms, a direct and significant economic penalty layered on top of the military response. Here's the real question that determines how seriously to take what happened next. Was this round of strikes just another proportional tit-for-tat exchange, similar to smaller flare-ups that had occurred earlier without derailing the broader ceasefire framework? Or did it represent something qualitatively different? The scale is the first clue that this was not a minor, contained response. U.S. officials explicitly noted that this round of attacks was considerably more extensive than a previous, smaller strike conducted in response to a similar tanker attack weeks earlier, one that the military had gone out of its way to describe publicly as purely proportional and not intended to restart the broader war. And then came the NATO summit remarks. And this is where the story shifts from a military exchange into something with genuinely different diplomatic stakes. Trump did not simply confirm that strikes had occurred. He declared on the record at NATO's own gathering that the ceasefire was effectively over, and he renewed a specific and considerably more alarming threat that the United States might target Iranian civilian infrastructure directly, specifically mentioning electric plants and desalination facilities. "I don't want to do that," he said, "but if we have to, we'll take them out." It's worth pausing on that specific threat because deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure like water and power plants is generally considered a war crime under international humanitarian law, a fact that several outlets covering these remarks explicitly noted. Whether this was a genuine operational threat or a maximum pressure negotiating tactic aimed at forcing Iranian concessions is impossible to know with certainty from the outside. But the fact that a sitting American president raised it explicitly in public at a summit meant to project alliance discipline and restraint tells you something important about where his actual frustration level currently sits. Consider why desalination and power infrastructure specifically carries this kind of legal weight, because it's worth understanding rather than simply noting in passing. Unlike a military radar site or a naval installation, a desalination plant and the electrical grid feeding it serve an entire civilian population's basic survival needs. Drinking water and, by extension, food production and public health infrastructure that depends on reliable electricity. International humanitarian law generally draws a sharp distinction between legitimate military targets and infrastructure whose destruction would primarily and foreseeably harm civilians rather than degrade an adversary's fighting capacity. That distinction is precisely why this specific threat generated so much more attention among legal analysts and international observers than the strikes on radar installations and small boats that had already occurred by that point. A threat against military infrastructure, however aggressive, operates within a familiar and broadly accepted framework. A threat against the water supply of an entire population does not. Trump went further still, raising the possibility of reimposing the naval blockade on Iranian ports that had been lifted just weeks earlier as part of the ceasefire agreement. "We may put it back, the blockade, and it'll only be a blockade for Iran," he told reporters, while separately acknowledging the specific risk that doing so could push Iran to respond by planting naval mines throughout the strait, a tactic Iran has used repeatedly throughout this conflict, and one directly reminiscent of the so-called tanker war Iran waged during the final years of its war with Iraq in the 1980s. And he did not hold back rhetorically either. Trump called Iran's leadership cuckoo and a bunch of liars, and in comments to reporters described them in considerably harsher terms still. "I don't want to deal with them anymore," he said. "They're scum. You know what scum is? They're scum. They're sick people. They're led by sick people, and they're vicious, violent people." This is not the language of careful, measured diplomatic signaling. This is the language of someone who has concluded, at least in the moment, that the diplomatic track has failed. But here's what happened next, and it matters enormously for understanding whether this represents an actual point of no return or simply an unusually harsh moment inside an ongoing, volatile negotiation. Hours after those remarks, the United States launched another round of strikes. Cruise missiles struck areas near a bridge in Ankara County in Iran's northeastern Golestan province, roughly 900 miles from the Strait of Hormuz itself, a geographic expansion that represents a meaningful departure from the pattern established earlier in this specific flare-up, where American strikes had remained tightly focused on military infrastructure in southern Iran near the strait. Trump also specifically mentioned a strike on Karg Island, a major hub responsible for a substantial share of Iran's oil export infrastructure, while explicitly instructing that the oil pipelines themselves not be targeted. "Don't hit the pipes," he said he told commanders. "Just hit everything else." He went further, floating the idea that the United States could potentially take over Karg Island outright, a statement that, if taken at face value, represents a considerably more expansive objective than simply degrading Iran's ability to interfere with shipping. Iran's retaliation came quickly. Early Thursday, sirens sounded across both Bahrain and Kuwait, warning residents of incoming missile and drone threats. Kuwait's army said its air defenses were actively responding to what it described as hostile missile and drone threats. Bahrain's Interior Ministry urged citizens to remain calm and move to the nearest safe location. Iran's retaliatory strikes reportedly hit roughly 85 American military-linked installations across the two countries. a scale that, while still notably smaller than the peak intensity of the original February through April phase of this conflict, represents a genuine and significant escalation beyond the smaller, more contained exchanges that had characterized the weeks immediately preceding this flare-up. Iran's foreign ministry framed its position clearly in response, arguing that the United States had itself invalidated the Memorandum of Understanding through what it characterized as a series of flagrant violations, specifically citing the revocation of Iran's oil export license, American interference with Iranian operations in the Strait, and what Iran described as a failure to restrain Israeli military action in Lebanon. Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, Iran's parliamentary speaker and its chief negotiator in talks with Washington, struck a defiant tone in public remarks, writing that the era of bullying and extortion is over, and insisting we don't fold. Now, let's talk about the part of this story that connects most directly back to the NATO summit itself, because it's genuinely one of the more revealing threads running through this entire episode. According to diplomats who spoke with Reuters, NATO foreign ministers were scheduled to meet on the sidelines of the Ankara summit, specifically with their counterparts from Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE, precisely to discuss how to handle the ongoing Strait crisis. This was not a peripheral concern at this summit. It was being actively worked as a genuine agenda item, running in parallel to the more publicized disputes over defense spending and alliance cohesion that dominated the headlines. And in the middle of all of this, Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson took a specific and pointed shot at NATO's own leadership, referring to Secretary General Mark Rutte as a courtier, accusing him of trying to curry favor with Washington by publicly backing what Iran considers an unlawful American military operation. Think about what that specific jab actually represents. It is Iran directly inserting itself into the broader narrative about NATO's internal cohesion and its relationship with the Trump administration, using the exact same language of subservience and favor currying that has been circulating in discussions about certain NATO members' posture toward Washington throughout this entire summit. Whether intentional or not, that comment ties this Gulf crisis directly into the broader story of an alliance visibly working through questions about its own unity and independence at the exact same moment. There's also a specific diplomatic maneuver happening in parallel that deserves real attention because it tells you something important about Iran's actual strategic position right now. The UAE reportedly proposed a plan to the International Maritime Organization specifically designed to manage transit through the strait, an initiative that 8 other unspecified Gulf-aligned states reportedly supported. Iran rejected that proposal outright, arguing it lacked what Iranian officials described as sufficient legal basis and exceeded the IMO's proper technical authority. Iran had previously also rejected a separate Omani proposal, under which shipping companies would voluntarily pay transit fees, an arrangement that would have addressed part of Iran's stated economic grievance without formally handing Tehran direct control over vessel routing. This is the real question worth sitting with, because it cuts to the heart of Iran's actual strategic calculation here. Independent analysis from groups tracking this conflict closely has consistently argued that Iran is not primarily fighting over money or even over the specific technical question of which shipping channel vessels use. It is fighting to preserve the strait as a source of genuine geopolitical leverage, full stop. If Iran cannot control the pace and terms of traffic through this waterway, it loses one of the very few tools of pressure it retains in any broader negotiation with Washington and the Gulf states, a tool considerably more consequential than its conventional military capability at this specific moment. This is precisely why Iran has continued attacking vessels and rejecting compromise proposals that might otherwise seem to offer a reasonable diplomatic middle ground. From Tehran's perspective, any arrangement that removes its direct control over strait transit removes the single most powerful card it currently holds. There's a historical echo here worth understanding because Iran has been in exactly this strategic position once before, decades ago, and the parallel is instructive rather than simply decorative. Toward the end of its war with Iraq in the late 1980s, with the conflict largely stalemated on land, Iran turned to exactly this same body of water as an alternative theater of pressure, laying mines and attacking tanker traffic in what became known as the Tanker War. A campaign specifically designed to impose costs on its adversaries and their commercial partners when direct military victory on land had become unattainable. The specific tactics on display right now, missile attacks on individual tankers, mine warfare, small boat harassment, are not new inventions. They are a deliberate return to a playbook Iran has used before, precisely because that playbook has historically proven effective at imposing real economic costs on adversaries without requiring Iran to win a conventional military confrontation it cannot realistically win. And that's not the most important part of the broader picture either, because Gulf states themselves are already responding to this recurring pattern of disruption with their own long-term structural solution, one that will matter considerably more than any single round of strikes once it's actually completed. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE are reportedly working on plans to extend their existing energy pipeline infrastructure, specifically to allow them to bypass the Strait of Hormuz entirely, reducing their exposure to exactly this kind of recurring Iranian disruption over the medium to long term. If that infrastructure eventually comes fully online, it would represent a genuinely significant permanent reduction in the strategic value of the strait as a choke point, regardless of how this current specific flare-up ultimately resolves. Iran, in other words, may be fighting hardest to preserve leverage at the exact moment its neighbors are actively building the infrastructure that will eventually make that leverage considerably less valuable. This creates a genuinely interesting strategic race worth watching closely over the coming years, even as the immediate crisis plays out over the coming days. Every time Iran demonstrates its willingness and ability to disrupt traffic through the strait, it simultaneously strengthens the economic case inside Riyadh, Kuwait City, and Abu Dhabi for accelerating exactly the kind of bypass infrastructure investment that will eventually diminish Iran's leverage permanently. In a very real sense, Iran's short-term tactical success at disrupting shipping and forcing renewed American military engagement may be actively undermining its own long-term strategic position by giving its neighbors an increasingly urgent and well-funded incentive to simply build their way around the entire problem rather than continuing to negotiate with Tehran over access terms indefinitely. So where does this leave us right now? And what should you actually be watching for over the next several days? The 60-day negotiating window established under the Islamabad Memorandum was specifically reserved for direct technical talks over Iran's nuclear program and potential sanctions relief. Those talks had already been paused for roughly a week, while Iran held funeral proceedings for its former supreme leader. And following this latest exchange of strikes, further substantive negotiations between American and Iranian teams appear considerably less likely in the near term than they did just days ago, even though Trump has stopped short of declaring the diplomatic track entirely and permanently finished, saying he would consult with his diplomatic team before making that determination. Watch specifically for whether the naval blockade Trump floated reimposing actually gets reinstated, since that single decision would represent the most consequential concrete escalation available to the United States short of a dramatically expanded air campaign, and watch closely for Iran's specific response if it does, given Trump's own explicit acknowledgement that Iran could respond by mining the strait again. Watch for whether additional countries follow through on deploying minesweeper vessels to the region, a step Trump specifically mentioned was already being coordinated among multiple nations. Watch for oil and gas prices over the coming days, since markets have already begun moving on this news. And a sustained price shock would create exactly the kind of domestic political pressure that has previously nudged American decision-making back toward negotiation in similar moments during this broader extended crisis. And watch specifically for whether Iran's rejection of the UAE's IMO proposal and the earlier Omani fee arrangement hardens into a permanent negotiating position, or whether continued military pressure eventually forces some kind of face-saving compromise that allows Tehran to claim it preserved its principle while still allowing normal international shipping to resume. What happened this week is not simply another exchange of strikes in a conflict that has already seen several rounds of exactly that pattern. It is a genuine test of whether a ceasefire negotiated under real diplomatic pressure just 3 weeks ago can actually survive contact with the specific, narrow, high-stakes question that has proven hardest to resolve throughout this entire year-long crisis. Who actually controls the Strait of Hormuz, and on whose terms? The answer to that question, more than any single statement from any single leader, is what will actually determine whether the broader war between Iran and the United States has genuinely resumed, or whether this represents one more violent, costly, but ultimately contained flare-up inside a fragile peace that both sides, for their own very different reasons, may still prefer to preserve. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, and tell us whether you think this ceasefire can actually be salvaged, or whether what we watched unfold this week represents the genuine, if not yet formally declared, resumption of this entire war. That question, more than any single press conference or official statement, is the one that will define the next several weeks of this crisis. If you're not subscribed yet, this is the moment. Hit the bell, because this situation is moving by the hour, and we will be here covering every verified development as it happens.